Uncertainty is essentially this notion where you don't even know what might go wrong. And this is kind of what's in this setting, right, where you have a really radical new innovation, and we're literally talking about space, right, rocket science. There are just so many things that you don't even know what could have gone wrong.
Hey there, my name is Eric, and this is Delve, a thought leadership podcast by the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. I'm a producer on the show, and I'm going to be your host today. So, if you're a sci-fi fan like me, this interview should be an interesting one. I'm speaking with Professor Sen Chai, an expert on strategy and organization here at McGill University, about the space tourism industry. So since the NASA Challenger space shuttle exploded in 1986, the idea of commercial spaceflight was kind of relegated to science fiction books and bingeable TV series. But over the past 15 years, we've entered something of a new space age, with juggernauts like Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, and Blue Origin laying the foundations for a brand new space travel industry. But given the complexity of their work and the risks involved in spaceflight, the only thing they can be certain about is uncertainty itself. And sometimes, when you're developing this kind of technology, people can get hurt. And that's exactly what happened in 2014 when a ship was torn apart mid-flight, killing one of the test pilots and severely injuring the other. So what happens to an industry when tragedy strikes just as it's about to take off? So here's a look at the crash, how it shook the industry to its core, and what it teaches us about risk management and stakeholder relations. So let's delve into it. So Professor Sen Chai, thanks so much for joining us on the Delve podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're talking about the kind of complicated relationship between innovation, risk, and failure, especially when it comes to new and potentially dangerous technologies. So in one of your research papers, you looked at a particularly salient example of this in the case of Virgin Galactic. So for our listeners, for those who don't know, Virgin Galactic is a commercial space company. And in 2014, during a test flight, a pilot died in a crash and a co-pilot was severely injured. So now, risk, it's present in every kind of innovation in every sector. It's not just limited to the space industry. But the case of Virgin Galactic is interesting here because of just how new of an industry it is. So I'm curious about how failure kind of plays out in this context. So just to start us off, I'm wondering if you could just paint us a picture of what was happening in the organization in the lead up to that incident.
Yeah, sure. So Virgin Galactic was founded in 2004, right? So 10 years before the crash occurred. And, within these 10 years, what the firm was trying to do was really develop this technology, right? So the spacecraft that crashed was called, Spaceship Two, and it was actually modeled based on Spaceship One that had won the Ansari X Prize. And so essentially, in order to win the prize, what they had to do is to get to space twice within the span of 2 weeks. And they won essentially, $10 million USD for it. And so the issue with Spaceship One is that it's actually a very small kind of prototype ship that could only have two individuals in there, right? The pilot and the co-pilot. But because Virgin Galactic is trying to do, make it commercial and have passengers in there, they spent most of those 10 years trying to make Spaceship One bigger. But, right, essentially, right, as we know from physics, right, if you're adding if you're making it bigger, you're adding more weight to the spaceship, and adding more weight makes it harder to escape, the gravity of the Earth. And so that's essentially kind of what they were trying to do. And with Spaceship Two, initially, what they wanted is to have, the pilot and the co-pilot along with 6 other passengers.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's a bit of incentive there to try to make it work because there was the award that happened. And so did that push them in a direction to potentially take more risks as they were trying to get this project off the ground?
I think in terms of risk, right, they won the prize, right? So that was kind of set and done. And the prize was actually won by another company, right? And so what Spaceship Two did is, and Richard Branson, the founder, right, of Virgin Galactic, because he essentially kind of went around and looked at the different technologies that were available at the time, and kind of pinpointed and identified, right, Spaceship One as like one potential technology that they could model Spaceship Two after. And so, in terms of risk, the way that they talk about risk is very different, right? But I think what I want to get a little bit more into is really this notion of risk versus uncertainty. So risk is essentially, when you actually know what might go wrong, and you actually, as a company, you're more or less sure of what the probabilities of that risk is. Uncertainty is actually quite different, right? Because uncertainty is essentially this notion where you don't even know what might go wrong. And this is kind of what's in this setting, right, where you have a really radical new innovation, and we're literally talking about space, right, rocket science. There are just so many things that you don't even know what could have gone wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, uncertainty versus risk, and it's the unknown unknowns. So then how do they adjust after that kind of incident?
Virgin Galactic actually knew almost like instantaneously, as soon as the ship disintegrated in the air, what had happened. But it took the NTSB, right, the National Transportation Safety Board of the U.S., a couple of months, I think 9 months, to actually come up with the reports. And what they had found with this specific accident is that it was pilot error.
Hey, this is Eric jumping in with a quick summary of the incident just because it is getting a little technical here. So basically, one of the pilots deployed the ship's feathering system a little too early. So this involves adjusting the tail wings to stabilize the ship as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere. But at the time that it was deployed, the ship was still traveling too slow, and the resulting air turbulence put too much force on the wing, which is ultimately what caused the ship to crash. So hopefully that helps contextualize the rest of the conversation. So let's get back to the interview. Well, I guess, so what do you do in that case? So like if it's user error, like assuming, because that's something like you could do everything right.
Yeah.
But then in the moment,
right.
That's something that goes wrong. And
Yeah.
It's just one person. And it's a high pressure situation.
Right.
Like
exactly.
It's the adrenaline's, like the G forces and
the G forces on top of that.
Yeah,
right.
so making decisions in that context.
Right.
But that's something very small. So like, how do you plan against that?
Right. So in Spaceship Two, the one that disintegrated, they didn't have a kind of a redundancy. Right. They didn't have a failsafe for that lever to be pulled to change the configuration of the tail. And so, what Virgin Galactic did was the first thing, right, in their new and the newly built spaceship, they added a failsafe. But they also changed some of the procedures, right, in terms of what the co-pilot and the pilot were supposed to do. And they're supposed to kind of call out each other's maneuvers so that it's not just one person making the decision, it's actually two people. And that that actually happens, right? So most of these pilots, right, they were ex-military pilots, right, and they actually, right, they know these procedures quite well. And even in small planes, right? So I used to be a private plane pilot, and we had to go through the checklists and procedures. It's the same way. So they essentially made sure that these procedures were properly followed.
So then zooming out a little bit, so kind of an interesting outcome of this incident was just sort of the public attention on not just Virgin Galactic, but just on the industry as a whole.
Exactly.
So I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about that.
So still now, there's quite a lot of pushback. And at that time, there was a lot of pushback because Virgin Galactic essentially killed somebody, right? And, the other kind of characteristic of this industry is that all of the big firms, right? So if we think Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, Blue Origin, right? They're all founded by these, tech billionaires, right? And so the pushback really was the fact that, this is really frivolous, right? This is just kind of a joyride for the rich. Why are we doing this? But from an industry perspective, what we know from kind of quite a few, years of research is that nascent industries usually the way that they emerge is that in the very beginning, because there are so little firms, and because there's just so much uncertainty in terms of not only the technology but also the demand, etc. A lot of these firms they'll actually band together in order to try to legitimate that industry. And that's kind of what happened, at least with Virgin Galactic and with this, private space industry, and especially this subsegment of space tourism, because the whole industry was so new and so nascent. Most of them kind of banded together.
So is that just money as a motivator? Is that just like, we invested a lot in these companies and we want them to succeed?
I mean, I think it depends on how you see it, and people have very different opinions about it, right? For any of these new industries, many times, right, we think it's about money, but a lot of times it's also about exploration, right? And for space travel, it is. I think especially for those who are in support of the industry, it's really about kind of getting outside of what humanity can do, right, and to kind of explore further than just kind of under our own noses, right? Obviously, you have kind of the detractors who are saying, well, all these billionaires, they have so much money, they could be using it to solve issues that we have on Earth, and we know there are plenty of those as well.
Yeah, and this would map out differently if it was a different product being developed. Maybe I just think about clinical trials, for example.
Right. So this is now, right? There's the FDA, and then you have all these phases. But if you go back in history, right, there are plenty of examples of drugs, right, that had major secondary effects, and that kind of slipped through. And so, right, it does, right. We also learn, right, not only do the firms learn, but also do the regulatory bodies. And again, right, because this is such a nascent industry, they weren't even sure who would be the regulatory body overseeing this, right? So it was, at the end of the day, right, for the accident, it was the NTSB, which again, right, goes back to airlines. And then, they were getting a lot of checks from the FAA, but they're airline based, right? It's not for space travel. And so the regulations are also not fully built.
Yeah. And that points to an interesting dynamic of self-regulation versus governmental regulation. So it almost sounds like self-regulation is kind of necessary in the beginning stages anyway, to start to until policy kind of catches up. But I don't know. But then there's the other side of that is if government doesn't catch up, and then if these companies outgrow or grow extremely large, then
right,
they might
dictate, right?
Yeah, and they might start arguing against regulation. Do you see that trending in one direction or another in this particular industry?
Yeah, so I think with space travel, because they've had, quite a few setbacks and quite a few crashes, right? Not only with Virgin Galactic, but also SpaceX, and Blue Origin has had some issues as well. I think regulation has caught up. It has caught up faster than in other industries, right? So if we think about generative AI, right, that industry has really taken off and it has been adopted really quickly, but regulation is really kind of lacking there.
Yeah, I guess getting into maybe a little bit more of the philosophical questions. But I just remember there was a press conference, or Richard Branson released a statement after the crash, and he was quoted as saying, "Every new transformative technology requires risk." So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that particular quote?
So I don't think he's not wrong, right? In that, if we kind of go back, right, with airlines, with prior modes of transportations, right, and even as we were talking about drugs, right, most of these technologies and then the industries that they've spurred, right, they go through a phase of kind of high risk, right, as the technologies kind of mature, and then at some point, right, they're safe enough for the general public.
Yeah.
Right? So I actually agree with him, and I think, especially from an innovations perspective, right, if we want to try to push the boundaries, I mean, you've got to be taking risks if you want to be making radical innovations compared to incremental innovations.
So then how do we decide when an innovation is worth the risk?
So I think people have different risk tolerances, right? And in the case of Virgin Galactic, the crash occurred during the innovation process, right? So yes, they killed someone, right? They killed the co-pilot, but he was a test pilot, right? And test pilots, they know what the risks are, right? And that's part of their jobs, right? Not to say that his life is not important, right? But right? Test pilots have a different kind of tolerance towards risks. I think it's different when you're putting people, right? If they were putting people, like actual passengers onto the spacecraft, and something happened, then the pushback would be very different.
Yeah. So then what lessons can we draw here?
At least from like Virgin Galactic's perspective, we found was the way that they talked about the technology, the way they framed the technology. They had to do like a complete about face, right? So before the crash, they essentially talked about the technology as if it was an airline, and that was problematic for them, right? In that if, we went back to all of their press releases and we looked at their websites, and, there are quotes such as, that essentially, right, they're really just talking about how safe the vehicle was and how they've kind of mitigated for all the risks, which is not very different from like what they were actually going through. And what they did afterwards was that they kind of changed their framing and made it much closer to the risks that they were facing, but also the uncertainty that they were facing. So it was really all about promise, right? And that they had everything kind of, where all the risks were taken care of. And then suddenly, right, there was a crash.
Yeah.
And stakeholders realized that what they were saying was actually very different than what they were facing in the development.
Now, can you do that in the beginning? Like if you just started a company and you want, investments, like
that's really what the problem is, right?
Yeah.
Is that, as usually, right, with startups, founders are much more about promise, right? Because you need support, or you need financial support, you need, all kinds of like capital support. But we believe that especially if you're in a business where the uncertainty is so high, you probably should talk about it a little bit at least.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what SpaceX did differently.
Interesting. How does this case study kind of affect your personal understanding of failure and innovation?
So when we're thinking about failure kind of from an innovation or technology perspective, right, we talked about the difference between innovation failure and operational failures, right? And in operational failures, the strategy that firms take are different. They're also given less leeway, right? Because you should have known better because, you've been doing this. Right? It's kind of routine. And so when operational failures occur, especially when they're huge, then you go into crisis management, and there's quite a lot of research that tells you how to crisis manage, right? So obviously in the case of innovation failures and catastrophic innovation failures, it's still a crisis, right? But you're given a little bit more leeway. You're probably going to be given more leeway depending on how you initially had started talking about and framing the technology that you were doing.
Professor Sen Chai, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much again for having me. It was fun.
And that's our show. Thanks so much to Professor Sen Chai for joining us, and thank you for listening. To read more about Professor Chai's work, I'll leave a link in the show notes to her study. Be sure to check it out. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a Delve podcast episode. Delve is the official thought leadership platform for the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. My name is Eric DeCare. I produced and edited this episode of the podcast. Saku Mantara is the editor-in-chief of Delve, and he also produced all the original music. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.